My name is Olivia. I'm 29 years old, and I was standing in the driveway in the rain with one bag when the front door slammed behind me, not gently, with the specific force of someone who wanted the closing to be heard, who needed the sound of it to mean something, to be a punctuation mark on a sentence that had been building for the better part of an hour. The rain was the kind that comes in the early spring in Indianapolis, cold and indifferent, hitting the pavement and the hood of my father's truck and the top of my head with equal lack of interest. I stood there for a moment and I looked at the door and I thought about all the things I could have done in that moment, knocked, called out, waited for someone to come after me. My mother was behind that door. She had said nothing. Not during the argument, and not when my father said what he said, and not when I went upstairs and packed the bag and came back down. She had stood in the kitchen doorway with her hands around a coffee mug, and she had watched me move through the house with the specific stillness of someone who has decided that the most comfortable position is no position at all. That silence was its own answer. I picked up the bag. I walked down the driveway. I did not look back. They wanted me gone so badly, they never stopped to ask what happened after. Before I tell you what happened after, I need to take you back. Because the driveway and the rain and the slammed door are not where this story starts. This story starts much earlier in the specific way that these things always start, which is quietly and gradually and in places nobody is paying close enough attention to notice. Before I do that, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and your local time. I want to know who is in this room with me tonight. Now let me take you back. My father's name is Thomas. He is 58 years old and he has run Mercer Home Construction since I was 12, which is when his previous employer went under and he decided, with the specific confidence of a man who has never thoroughly examined the gap between his confidence and his competence, that he would build something of his own. The company did well enough in the early years, regional residential construction in a market that was growing. He had the skills, genuinely, in the field, with the physical work, with the relationship management that came from standing on a job site and knowing what you were talking about. He was competent. He built a reputation. What he could not do and never learned to do and eventually stopped trying to do was everything else. The administrative structure of running a construction company is not glamorous. It is payroll and vendor contracts and insurance verification and licensing renewals and state compliance deadlines and tax coordination and the 100 small systems that exist in the background of any operating business and that most people never think about because they are working correctly. They are working correctly because someone is making them work correctly. In Mercer Home Construction for the past 6 years, that someone was me. I did not set out to become the operational backbone of my father's company. It started when I was 22, fresh out of a 2-year business administration program that I had funded through a combination of scholarships and part-time work. And my father had a payroll issue that he did not understand and could not fix, and was about to cost him 3 employees on a Friday afternoon. I fixed it in 40 minutes. He said, "Good, thanks," and went back to the job site. I stayed, not because I was asked to, because I could see the other things that needed fixing, and I had the specific disposition of someone who cannot observe a problem they know how to solve without doing something about it. Over the following months, I built the payroll system properly. I set up the vendor management database. I organized the licensing calendar. I established the relationships with the insurance contacts and the state compliance office and the accountant, Harold Bennett, who had been trying to manage my father's business records for 3 years with the patient resignation of someone who has accepted that certain clients require significantly more work than they understand they require. Harold and I developed a working relationship built entirely on mutual recognition that we were both doing work that nobody else in the building appreciated. I was not paid for any of this, not in the first year, not in the second. My father provided room and board and the occasional cash payment that was framed as generosity rather than compensation, which is the specific accounting that happens in family businesses, where the labor of a family member is understood as a contribution rather than a transaction. By the 3rd year, I was carrying the full administrative and operational infrastructure of a company with 11 employees and active projects valued at several $1 million. By the 6th year, I could not have told you exactly when the helping had become the holding up, because the transition had been so gradual that there was no single moment I could point to. There was just the daily work and the quiet competence with which I did it, and the complete absence of acknowledgement from the person whose business it was. My brother Jason is 26. He is 3 years younger than me and has occupied, for as long as I can remember, the specific position in the family that is reserved for the future. Not the present, where the actual work happens, the future, where the potential lives, perpetually impressive and perpetually undemonstrated. My father talked about Jason the way people talk about an investment they expect to mature. He was going to run the company eventually. He was learning the business. He had the instincts. He just needed time. What Jason actually did was come into the office twice a week, take phone calls from clients in a tone that implied authority he had not earned, expense meals and equipment through the business accounts with the casual ease of someone who had never been told that money required accounting, and accept the title of junior operations manager that my father had given him 6 months earlier without any corresponding responsibilities being transferred from me to him. Because transferring the responsibilities would have required explaining what they were, and explaining what they were would have required my father to admit how much there was, which would have required acknowledging who had been doing it. That acknowledgement never came. The argument was about money, not directly. These arguments are never directly about what they are about. They are about accumulated pressure, finding a release point that is not the actual source of the pressure. The surface argument was about a vendor payment I had flagged 3 weeks earlier as structurally problematic, a contract renewal that had been verbally committed to by my father without the terms being formalized, which created a liability that could not be properly recorded without documentation that didn't exist. I had flagged it. I had asked for the documentation. I had asked twice more. The documentation had not arrived. When the vendor called with a payment dispute on a Thursday evening, my father's response was to turn to me and say I had managed it wrong. I said I had flagged it 3 times and produced no documentation to flag. He said I was being difficult. I said I was being accurate. He said if I thought running this company was so easy, I should try doing it without his support. I said something I had not said in 6 years of doing work that was not seen, which was that I was not sure what support of his I had been receiving. The room went very quiet. Jason was at the kitchen table and he looked at his phone. My mother was in the kitchen doorway. My father looked at me with the specific expression of a man who has encountered a response he did not expect from a direction he considered safe, and whose reaction to surprise is always to increase pressure rather than examine its source. He said, "Get out." Then he said, "Now." I went upstairs. I packed one bag. I packed it with the specific efficiency of someone who has been mentally prepared for a version of this moment for longer than they have consciously acknowledged. Clothes, laptop, charger, documents, the folder. The folder was the thing nobody noticed. It was a standard accordion folder, the kind that sits in a home office without attracting attention because it looks like the kind of organizational material that exists in every home with a printer and an intention toward order. It had been sitting on the corner of the desk in the room I used as a home office for 6 years. Inside it was a complete set of the company's administrative documentation, vendor contracts, licensing certificates, insurance policy summaries, compliance calendars, payroll structure, system access credentials organized in a format that I had maintained because I had learned early that the documentation of a system and the system itself are equally important, and that the documentation existed so that the system could be handed off or reconstructed if necessary. I had maintained it out of professional habit. Nobody had ever asked about it. Nobody had ever asked about it because nobody had ever thought about what it represented. I put the folder in the bag next to the laptop. I came downstairs. My mother was still in the kitchen doorway. Jason had not moved from the table. My father was in the living room with his back to me. I walked through the house I had been carrying for 6 years, and I opened the front door and I went outside, and the rain hit the pavement around me, and behind me the door slammed with the force of someone making a point. I walked to the end of the driveway. I called a car. 40 minutes later, I was in a motel room 6 miles from the house, sitting on the edge of the bed with my bag on the floor and my phone in my hand. I turned the phone off. The silence was the specific silence of a space that belongs entirely to you. No systems to check, no deadlines to track, no payroll running in the background of your awareness, like a low, persistent sound you have stopped hearing as a sound because it has become the baseline condition of your existence. I lay down on the motel bed. I looked at the ceiling, and for the first time in 6 years, I slept without the ambient pressure of everything I was maintaining pressing on the surface of my rest. I did not set an alarm. In the morning, when I turned my phone back on, I would find out what happened when the systems I had maintained for 6 years encountered a morning without me. But that was morning. This was now, and now was the first quiet I had had in a very long time. I closed my eyes, and the 32 missed calls were already waiting. I just didn't know it yet. I turned my phone on at 7:43 the next morning, not because an alarm told me to, because I had slept, genuinely slept, for the first time in longer than I could accurately measure, and my body had woken itself at 7:43 with the specific alertness of someone whose system has finally completed a rest cycle that had been interrupted for years. I lay on the motel bed for a moment looking at the ceiling. Then I turned on my phone. The screen took approximately 4 seconds to process the incoming notifications. 32 missed calls. I looked at the number for a moment the way I look at figures that require verification before response, not with surprise exactly, but with the specific attention of someone who wants to be certain they are reading correctly before deciding what to do with the information. 32. Between 11:17 the previous night and 7:31 this morning, my father's number accounted for 14 of them, my mother's for 9, Jason's for 3, Harold Bennett's for 4, 2 from numbers I recognized as vendor contacts, 1 from a number I identified after a moment as the State Compliance Office's main line, which did not make calls at 6 in the morning unless something had triggered an automated alert. I did not listen to the voicemails immediately. I made coffee first. The motel had a small machine on the counter, and I used it, and I sat on the edge of the bed with the cup in my hands, and I thought about what 32 calls in 8 hours meant in operational terms, not emotional terms, operational ones. Something had failed overnight, or multiple things had failed. The question was which systems and in what sequence. I had a working hypothesis before I pressed play on the first voicemail. The payroll system was the first thing. I knew this before Harold confirmed it in his 4:17 in the morning voicemail, which he had left in the specific voice of a man who has been awakened by a problem he did not anticipate and is now sitting at his kitchen table at 4 in the morning trying to understand it. He said the automated payroll run had failed at midnight. The system had attempted to process the biweekly payment for Mercer Home Construction's 11 employees and had encountered an authentication error that caused the entire run to reject. The bank had received no transmission. The employees would wake up on Friday morning without direct deposits. I knew why this had happened. The payroll system I had built used a 2-factor authentication protocol that I had set up 2 years earlier after a security advisory from the bank. The protocol required a verification step through an authenticator application that lived on my phone. I had documented this in the folder. I had mentioned it to my father twice. I had written it in the administrative summary I updated quarterly and placed in Harold's file. Nobody had read the administrative summary. The authenticator was on my phone. My phone had been off. Harold's second voicemail, left at 5:48, said the vendor payment queue had also failed. 3 scheduled payments to active vendors, materials suppliers for 2 ongoing projects, bombs, had not processed because they were routed through a commercial account that required dual authorization. My credentials and my father's. My father's authorization code had expired 60 days ago, and I had sent him 3 emails requesting he renew it and had received no response. I had processed those payments for the past 60 days using a workaround that required my direct involvement each time. Without my direct involvement, the queue had simply stopped. Harold's third voicemail at 6:22 mentioned that the insurance verification certificate for the active job sites had not renewed. The certificate renewed automatically through an online portal that required annual credential confirmation. The confirmation window had been open for 11 days. I had sent my father a reminder at day 1 and day 7. The deadline was yesterday. I had been planning to complete it myself yesterday afternoon. Yesterday afternoon, I had been packing a bag. Harold's fourth voicemail at 6:55 said he was at the office and that he needed to speak with me urgently and that the situation was becoming complicated and that he wanted to understand what was happening before he spoke with Thomas. I finished my coffee. I called Harold back. Harold Bennett at 63 had the specific quality of someone who had spent 40 years in accounting and had developed through 4 decades of professional proximity to human financial decisions an almost complete inability to be surprised by the consequences of poor organizational management. He answered on the first ring. He said, "Olivia." I said, "Harold." He said, "Tell me what I need to know." I said, "The payroll failed because the authentication is on my phone and my phone was off. The vendor payments failed because Dad's dual authorization code expired and I've been manually processing as a workaround. The insurance certificate didn't renew because I wasn't there to complete the confirmation window." A pause. He said, "Are any of these recoverable today?" I said, "The payroll can be reprocessed manually if someone with bank authority initiates a direct transfer. The vendor payments need Dad's authorization code renewed, which requires him to call the bank. The insurance certificate needs someone with the portal credentials to complete the confirmation. Those credentials are documented in the folder." He said, "What folder?" I said, "The accordion folder from my desk. It has everything documented, every system, every credential, every renewal calendar. It's in my bag." A pause that was longer than the previous ones. He said, "You took it with you." I said, "I maintain it. I brought it with me when I left." Another pause. Then Harold said, in the specific tone of someone arriving at a realization he has been approaching gradually and has now reached completely, "Olivia, how long have you been managing all of this?" I said, 6 years. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Does Thomas understand what failed and why?" I said, "No, he understands that things failed. He does not understand the operational structure well enough to understand why." Harold said, "I see." I said, "I need you to do something for me before I call him. I need you to pull the administrative summary from your file, the one I send you quarterly, and I need you to read it before you speak to him." He said, "I have it here." I said, "Read the section labeled Operational Dependencies. I'll hold." The line was quiet for 4 minutes. Then Harold came back. He said, "Olivia." I said, "Yes." He said, "I owe you an apology." I said, "You don't. You didn't know because nobody made it visible." He said, "I should have asked." I said, "Now you know." My father called at 8:17. I let it ring twice. Then I answered in the specific tone of someone taking a professional call, which was the tone I had decided was the appropriate register for this conversation. He said my name. I said, "Good morning." A pause that carried everything he was managing, the fury that was his default response to being in a position he had not chosen, the desperation that was underneath it because the position was genuinely untenable, and something else, something quieter that I had not heard from him before. He said, "Workers aren't getting paid." I said, "I know." He said, "The vendor payments didn't go through." I said, "I know." He said, "The insurance." I said, "I know, Dad." Silence. Then he said, "Come home and fix it." He said it in the voice he used for instructions, the voice that had never previously produced anything other than compliance because compliance had always been available. I said, "I'm not coming home." The silence that followed was the specific silence of someone whose reliable instrument has just failed to function and who does not yet have a replacement instrument available. He said, What do you mean you're not coming home?" I said, "I mean, I'm not coming back to the house. I'm willing to discuss how to address the operational issues, but that conversation is separate from the living situation." He said, "You can't just..." I said, "Dad, the payroll failed because the authentication is on my phone. The vendor payments failed because your authorization code expired and I've been compensating manually for 60 days. The insurance didn't renew because I wasn't there to complete the confirmation window. These things failed because I was the person maintaining them and I'm not there anymore. A very long silence. Then he said, "How do we fix it?" He said it differently from the instruction he had issued 30 seconds earlier. The voice had changed in a way that I noted without comment. The authority register had dropped slightly and something more functional had replaced it. I said, "Harold has the administrative summary. He's already reviewed it. I'll work with him on the immediate recovery steps. The payroll can be processed today if you initiate a manual transfer through the bank. I'll walk Harold through the others." He said, "And you'll come home after." I said, "No." Silence. I said, "I'll help stabilize the systems over the next few days remotely, but I'm not coming back to the house." He said, "Olivia." I said, "I have to go. Call your bank and ask them to process a manual transfer for the payroll. Tell them Harold will follow up with documentation." I hung up. I spent the morning working from the motel room. Harold and I coordinated the payroll recovery. The bank required specific documentation that Harold had from the administrative summary. The manual transfer was initiated by 11:15. Employees received their deposits by early afternoon. The vendor payment issue required my father to call the bank and complete the authorization renewal, which took 3 attempts because the process was not intuitive for someone who had never done it before. I walked Harold through it, and Harold walked my father through it. The vendors were paid by mid-afternoon. The insurance certificate required the portal credentials, which were in the folder. I provided them to Harold, who completed the confirmation. By 4 o'clock, the immediate operational failures had been addressed. By 4:15, my father called again. He said everything was handled. I said good. He said he appreciated it. I noted the word appreciated. It was not a word he used frequently in reference to anything I did. I filed it without attaching weight to it because a single word in a crisis does not constitute a pattern. He said again that he expected me home. I said again that I was not coming home. Then he said something I had not expected. He said Jason could handle the systems going forward. I said, "Okay." He said, "I'll have Jason learn what you were doing." I said, "Okay." He said, "So you don't need to worry about it." I said, "I'm not worried about it." And then I said something I had been thinking about since the morning's calls, since the 32 missed calls, since Harold's voice at 4 in the morning. I said, "Dad, before Jason starts learning the systems, I think you should sit down with Harold and go through the full administrative summary, not the recovery version, the full 6-year version, so you understand what's actually there." He said, "I know what's there." I said, "I don't think you do." He said, "Olivia," I said, "call Harold. Ask him to walk you through the full operational dependency map. It's in the summary. It'll take about 2 hours." He said, "2 hours?" I said, "At minimum." I hung up. That evening, I opened my laptop and I did something I had been meaning to do for 3 months. I sent an email to Daniel Whitaker, senior executive at North Point Logistics Group, with whom I had had 2 preliminary conversations in January about an operations director role that had been posted and that I had been following without allowing myself to fully pursue. Because fully pursuing it would have required acknowledging that I was ready to leave. I was ready to leave. The email was professional and specific. I referenced our January conversations. I said I was available to continue the discussion. I attached my resume and a portfolio document I had been building for 2 years that described, in appropriately anonymized terms, the operational work I had been doing. I sent it at 6:47 in the evening from a motel room 6 miles from the house where I had grown up. Then I opened the folder, not the business folder. A different folder, the one I had maintained for 18 months, separate from the company's administrative records, which contained the documentation I had been accumulating with the specific patient attention of someone who did not yet know exactly when they would need it, but understood that when they did, the quality of the documentation would matter. Tax filings, compliance notices, state regulatory correspondence, financial records that Harold had provided to me in my capacity as the person who managed the company's administrative systems. I had reviewed them periodically over the past 18 months, and I had understood, gradually and with increasing clarity, what they showed. The company was not stable. It had not been stable for a long time. It had been surviving because I had been quietly compensating for the instability the way you compensate for a structural issue in a building, not by fixing the structure, but by reinforcing around it constantly with the specific fatigue of someone who understands that the reinforcement is not permanent and is becoming unsustainable, but who has not yet had a reason to stop. I had a reason now. I read through the records again with the specific attention of someone who is no longer reading to manage, but to understand the full picture before deciding what to do with it. The picture was significant. Multiple tax filings had been submitted late, with penalties that had been paid from the operating account without my father understanding what the penalties were for. Several compliance notices from state regulatory bodies had been received, filed in the physical mail, and not addressed. I had found them during a records organization session 2 years ago and had quietly remediated the issues without telling my father, because telling him would have required explaining the regulatory framework, and he would not have engaged with the explanation. The company was carrying liabilities my father did not know the full extent of. Jason did not know they existed. And in the morning, Harold was going to walk my father through the full operational dependency map for the first time in 6 years. I thought about what that conversation would look like. Then I thought about Daniel Whitaker's company, North Point Logistics Group, which I knew from the industry research I had been doing for 18 months, had been actively acquiring distressed construction logistics assets in the Midwest region. I closed the folder, I looked at the ceiling, and I thought about a question I had not yet fully answered, which was whether what was about to happen to my father's company was going to happen to it, or whether I was going to have something to do with how it happened. Not out of anger, out of the specific competence of someone who could finally see the full structure of something she had been inside for 6 years, and who understood for the first time exactly what that visibility was worth. Daniel Whitaker responded at 6:52 the next morning. I had not expected to hear back that quickly. 3 months had passed since our January conversations, and professional courtesy suggested he would take at least a day to review what I had sent and formulate a response. The speed of his reply told me something about how the conversation had been received. He said he had reviewed my portfolio document and that it was, in his words, one of the clearest operational self-assessments he had seen from a candidate at any level. He said he wanted to schedule a call that week. He said North Point had been moving quickly on several Midwest acquisitions and that the director role was more urgent than it had been in January. I replied and said I was available any morning that week. He said Thursday at 9. I said Thursday at 9 was fine. I put the phone down, and I thought about the word acquisitions in his email, and I thought about the folder on my desk with the 18 months of documentation, and I thought about what I knew about North Point's acquisition strategy from the research I had been doing. Then I called Harold. Harold and my father had their conversation on Wednesday. Harold told me afterward that it had taken 2 hours and 40 minutes, which was longer than my estimate, and that my father had been largely silent throughout, not resistant, silent in the specific way of someone who is receiving information that is restructuring their understanding of something they believe they already understood. Harold said my father had asked at one point how long things had been this way. Harold had said 6 years at minimum, but that the full picture of the operational dependency was closer to 4 years of complete reliance, which was the period during which the business had grown beyond what the original informal systems could manage, and the new systems had been built by me without formal acknowledgement of what was being built or who was building it. My father had asked why Harold hadn't said something sooner. Harold had said he had assumed my father knew, because the alternative was that he didn't know. And if he didn't know, the question of how the business had been functioning was too uncomfortable to examine without being asked. Harold said my father had not responded to that. He also said that during the review of the tax and compliance records, my father had gone very still. I asked Harold what he thought my father's understanding of the situation was now. Harold said, I think he understands that he built something he didn't understand, and that the person he threw out in the rain was the reason it was still standing. I said, okay. Harold said, Olivia, what are you planning? I said, I have a call tomorrow morning. He said, with whom? I said, "Someone who may be relevant to the conversation you and I are going to have next week." He said, "I see." I said, "Keep Thursday afternoon open." The call with Daniel Whitaker on Thursday morning lasted 90 minutes. It was the most efficient professional conversation I had ever been part of, which was itself a form of information about the organization I was considering joining. Daniel asked specific questions and waited for complete answers and did not redirect before the answer was finished. He had read the portfolio document carefully, and his questions reflected that reading. He asked about the operational structures I had built. I described them accurately and completely, including the context of having built them without formal authority or recognition, which was a detail I included not for sympathy, but because it was operationally relevant. It demonstrated that the systems had been designed to be functional under constrained conditions, which was a more rigorous design environment than systems built with full organizational support. He said, "You built enterprise-level infrastructure in a small business context without the title or the resources." I said, "Yes," he said, "and it held for 6 years." I said, "Until I stopped holding it." A brief pause. He said, "How soon can you start?" I said, "I need to address one matter first. It may actually be relevant to North Point directly." He said, "Tell me." I described the situation with Mercer Home Construction in the specific terms that were professionally relevant: the operational structure, the financial instability, the compliance liabilities, the fact that the business was carrying debt against assets that were significantly underperforming given the liability structure. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What's the debt attached to?" I gave him the numbers from my documentation. Another pause. He said, "Olivia, North Point has been looking at the Indianapolis construction sector for 4 months. We have a list of distressed assets in the region." I said, "I know." He said, "Is this company on that list?" I said, "I don't know your list, but based on the financial profile, it should be." He said, "Send me the documentation you described." I said, "I'll send what I can ethically provide, which is the records I generated in my capacity as the operational administrator, properly noted as such." He said, "That's exactly what I need." I sent the documents that afternoon. By Friday morning, North Point's acquisition analysis team had confirmed that Mercer Home Construction was within their target parameters. The meeting at Harold's office happened on a Tuesday. My father arrived first. Jason came with him, which I had not expected, but which I also had not expected, because Jason had been copied on enough of the email thread Harold had managed that his presence was not illogical. My mother did not come. I arrived at the time Harold had specified. I wore what I wore to professional meetings, which was professional. I carried my laptop and the folder and the documents Daniel's team had authorized me to share in my capacity as North Point's newly contracted operations director, which was the title that had been formalized 2 days earlier. My father looked at me when I came into the conference room. He looked older than he had on Thursday evening when he had slammed the door. Not physically older. The specific aging that happens when someone's understanding of their situation has been significantly revised downward, and they have not yet fully processed the revision. I sat across from him. Harold introduced the meeting with the specific professional neutrality of someone who has decided that neutrality is the safest instrument for a situation with this many variables. I presented the operational picture first, not as a grievance, as a documented record. The systems I had built, the functions they performed, the timeline of their construction, the gap between what those functions represented and what had been formally recognized. I described it in the language of an operational audit, which was exactly what it was. My father listened. Jason listened. Neither of them said anything during the first 30 minutes. Then I presented the financial picture. The tax liabilities, the compliance penalties, the debt structure, the asset performance against that structure. I presented it the way Harold and I had prepared it, clearly, accurately, without additional interpretation, because the numbers interpreted themselves. Jason said, "This doesn't look right." I said, "Which part?" He looked at a specific line item and said the number was wrong. I said, "That's the accumulated compliance penalty from the 3 notices that weren't addressed between 2021 and 2023. It's in the state regulatory correspondence in column 4. He looked at column 4. He said nothing further. My father said, "What are you saying, Olivia?" I said, "I'm saying the company is carrying liabilities that the current operational structure cannot support, and that the systems required to maintain basic function are not transferable to someone without the administrative history to operate them." He said, "Jason can learn it." I said, "Jason can learn operational administration over time, yes. That's not the immediate issue. The immediate issue is the debt structure and the compliance exposure." Silence. Then I said, "I've accepted a position with North Point Logistics Group as Director of Operations. Part of North Point's current portfolio work involves acquisition of distressed construction assets in this region. Mercer Home Construction fits their acquisition parameters." My father was very still. I said, "North Point's acquisition would cover the outstanding debt, protect the existing employee contracts, and stabilize the operational infrastructure under new management. The alternative is that the compliance exposure triggers a regulatory review within the next quarter, which significantly complicates any future sale or restructuring." Jason said, "You work for the company that's buying us." I said, "I work for a company that is considering acquiring the debt and assets of a business that is currently structured unsustainably." "Yes." He said, I said, "It's business, Jason." My father said, "What do you want, Olivia?" He said it in a voice I had not heard from him before, not the instruction voice or the authority voice or the explosion voice. Something quieter. The voice of someone who has arrived at a question they have been avoiding and has decided that avoiding it is no longer viable. I said, "I want 3 things. The acquisition to include full protection of employee wages and benefits, documented and guaranteed before signing, transfer of ownership completed properly and permanently, and a formal acknowledgement from you to Harold, on record, of the operational work performed over the past 6 years and what it represented to the company." He said, "That's it." I said, "That's it." He said, "Not money." I said, "I have a salary now. I don't need money from you. I need the record to be accurate." He looked at Harold. Harold said, "The terms are standard. The acquisition structure is favorable given the alternative." My father looked at the table, then he looked at me. He said, "I didn't know." I said, "I know you didn't." He said, "I should have." I said, "Yes." He signed the documents 3 days later. Jason lost the junior operations title that had never been attached to actual operations. The employee contracts transferred with full protection. Harold oversaw the transition with the satisfaction of someone who had been waiting for the record to be made accurate for 6 years. My mother called me the evening after the signing. She said she had known for a long time what I had been carrying. I said, "I know you knew." She said, "I should have said something." I said, "Yes." She said, "I'm sorry, Olivia." I said, "I know." We talked for a few more minutes about ordinary things. It was not reconciliation. It was not closure in the cinematic sense. It was just 2 people who had a complicated history having a conversation that was honest for the first time. That was enough for now. 6 months later, I was standing in my office in Chicago overlooking a downtown skyline that was, at 8 in the morning in early autumn, exactly as I had imagined it when I had been sitting in a motel room 6 miles from my father's house. My badge read Director of Operations. My desk had a plant on it that I had bought myself because I had read that plants were good for focus, and I had decided to test the hypothesis. The hypothesis was confirmed. My phone buzzed with the family group message. I looked at it. I did not open it. I put my phone face down on the desk and I opened the approval paperwork for the healthcare benefit renewals for the former Mercer employees, now operating under North Point's construction division, and I signed it with the specific attention of someone who understands that the paperwork in front of them is not administrative. It is the actual point. Then I opened my desk drawer. I put the old house key inside it. I closed the drawer. I did not think about opening it again. I was thrown out of my family's house on a Thursday night in the rain with 1 bag. I checked into a motel and turned my phone off. The next morning I turned it on and found 32 missed calls. I called Harold and spent the day managing the operational collapse from a motel room. I told my father I wasn't coming back. I sent an email to Daniel Whitaker that evening. I spent 2 days documenting the full picture of what I had been carrying. I had a 90-minute call that turned into a job offer and a relevant acquisition conversation. I sat in Harold's office and presented the complete record to my father and my brother. My father signed the documents. The employees were protected. The record was made accurate. I moved to Chicago and signed benefit renewals for the people who used to thank me quietly while my family ignored me completely. That is the whole story. Now here's what I want to leave with you. Invisible work is still power. The fact that something is not seen does not mean it is not real. For 6 years, I maintained systems that kept 11 people employed and multiple projects funded and a family financially stable. None of that was acknowledged, none of it was recognized, and none of that changed what it was. It was real, and it was significant, and its significance became visible the moment I stopped performing it. The world always finds out what was invisible when the invisible thing disappears. The second thing is harder. My father did not throw me out because he didn't need me. He threw me out because he had never been required to understand how much he did. The absence of that understanding was not entirely his fault. I had made it easy for him not to understand by quietly compensating for everything he didn't know. There is a lesson in that about the difference between helping and enabling. Helping is doing something that supports someone's growth. Enabling is doing something that allows someone to avoid the consequences of not growing. I spent 6 years enabling. I told myself it was helping. It was not. If you are carrying something that the people around you have never had to understand because you have always been there to carry it, I want you to consider what it would mean to put it down. Not in anger, not as punishment, just as an honest accounting of what you have been doing and whether the doing of it is actually serving anyone, including you. The third thing, competence does not require permission. I built operational infrastructure with no title and no recognition and no formal authority because I could see what needed to be done and I knew how to do it. That competence existed regardless of whether anyone acknowledged it. It existed in the documentation and the systems and the working relationships and eventually in the portfolio document that Daniel Whitaker read on a Wednesday evening and responded to by 6:52 the next morning. Build the thing, document the thing. The acknowledgement comes later or it comes differently than you expected, but the thing you built is real regardless. I want to end today the way professionals end things when they mean it, not with a question, with something I found written in the margin of an old planner I kept during the hardest year. Year 3, when I had been carrying everything for long enough to feel the weight, but not yet long enough to understand what the weight was preparing me for. I had written in my own handwriting at the top of a Wednesday page, "The night they threw me out, they thought I was leaving empty-handed. They never realized I was the only thing holding their world together. I did not write that as revenge. I wrote it as a reminder to myself that what I was doing was real. It was, and it was enough. Tell me in the comments your first name and your city. Tell me if you have ever been the invisible infrastructure of something that didn't see you until you were gone. I want to know who is at this table tonight. Subscribe if you want to stay for the next one. Because the next story starts the same way all the real ones do, with someone who kept working long after the room stopped watching.